Hello, friends. If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments.
Stephen Callahan discovered it 3 weeks after moving into the house, which was 3 weeks after closing, which was 3 weeks after spending more money than he'd ever spent on anything in his life, on a piece of property that he was supposed to feel stable about. The discovery happened in the guest bedroom, a room he hadn't yet furnished, because he hadn't yet decided what the guest bedroom was for. He didn't have guests anymore. His daughter had moved to California for work. His ex-wife had moved to Portland. His friends had drifted, the way friends drift when a marriage ends and the social architecture that held them together collapses. The guest bedroom was a possibility rather than a necessity, a room that represented a future that hadn't yet solidified. He'd been standing in the afternoon light, looking at the wall between the guest bedroom and the master bedroom, trying to decide if he should paint the walls or leave them as they were. The walls were a neutral beige, the kind of color that previous owners chose when they were trying to make a space appeal to the broadest possible demographic. The paint was competent but impersonal. He'd been running his hand across the surface, feeling the slight variations in texture, thinking about whether painting the walls would make the space feel more like his, or would just be another way of imposing his will on a space that already existed without him. That was when he felt it, the outline of something rectangular in the wall, beneath the paint. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. He'd pressed his hand against it, and there was definitely a rectangular form, perhaps 3 feet by 2 feet, running vertically. He'd looked at the wall more carefully, stepped back, looked at the light coming through the window on the far side of the room. And then he understood. There was a window, a bricked-over window. An interior window that had been filled in with brick or block and then covered with drywall and paint, but the outline was still visible if you knew to look for it. The outline was barely perceptible, just a variation in the wall's surface, but once he'd seen it, he couldn't unsee it. He'd gone downstairs to find the inspection report. It was still in a box with other paperwork, the survey, the title search, the insurance documents. He'd pulled out the home inspection report and had flipped through it, looking for any mention of sealed windows or architectural modifications. The inspector, a man named Marcus, who had been recommended by the realtor and who had spent 3 hours walking through the house making notes, had documented the windows in the master bedroom, good condition, dual pane, north-facing, and had noted that the guest bedroom had a single window on the east side, adequate but somewhat old, single pane, could benefit from replacement. There was no mention of a sealed window, no note about architectural modifications, no comment about why there might be a rectangular outline in the wall. Stephen had called the realtor, a woman named Jennifer, who had shown him 12 houses over the course of 6 weeks before he'd finally settled on this one. "I have a question about the home inspection," he'd said. Jennifer had sounded confused. "Is something wrong?" "There's a window, an interior window. It's bricked over. It's between the guest bedroom and the master bedroom. It's not mentioned in the inspection report." There had been a pause. "I'm sure the inspector would have noted anything like that," Jennifer had said. He didn't. I have the report right here. There's nothing about it. Another pause. Where exactly is this window? He'd described the location, and Jennifer had said she'd call the inspector and get back to him. She'd called back 2 hours later. Marcus says he didn't see any evidence of a sealed window when he inspected the property. He said the wall looked normal to him. The wall looks normal from a distance, Stephen had said. But if you touch it, you can feel the outline. It's definitely there. Jennifer had been quiet. That's unusual. I don't know how that would have been missed. The previous owners didn't mention anything like that. Would you like me to contact them? Stephen had said yes, he would like her to contact them, and she'd hung up to make the call. He'd stood in the guest bedroom, running his hand over the barely perceptible outline, thinking about what it meant that something this obvious had been hidden so thoroughly. The drywall was good work. The paint was smooth. If you weren't looking for it, if you didn't know to run your hand along the wall, you'd never notice it. The previous owner hadn't just sealed the window. They'd concealed it so carefully that a professional home inspector had walked through and not noticed. Jennifer called back 40 minutes later. I got in touch with the sellers. They said they don't know anything about a sealed window. They don't know about it? That's what they said. They said the walls looked fine to them. They live in Virginia now. They sold the house partially through a broker because they were relocating, and they said they don't recall any major renovations. It's right here, Stephen had said. It's in the wall. I believe you, Jennifer had said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure. Would you like me to have Marcus go back and look at it specifically? Stephen had said yes, and Marcus had come back to the house 3 days later. He'd gone directly to the guest bedroom and had felt the wall, and his expression had changed. That's definitely there, he'd said. I don't know how I missed it. I'm sorry about that. What is it? Stephen had asked. Marcus had pressed his hands against the outline, trying to determine what was beneath the drywall. It's a window, an interior window. It's been sealed with brick or cinder block. Someone did a very thorough job. The drywall work is professional. The paint is seamless. If you're not actively looking for it, you wouldn't notice it. Why would someone do that? Marcus had shrugged. Could be aesthetic. Maybe they didn't like how the rooms connected. Could be for climate control. Blocking off a window might help with heating or cooling. Could be for privacy. Lots of reasons people seal off interior windows. But Stephen had known, somehow, that there was another reason. Something that the previous owner had wanted so badly to hide that they'd done professional grade work to conceal it. They hadn't just closed the window. They hadn't just put up drywall. They'd sealed it so thoroughly that a professional inspector hadn't noticed. So thoroughly that the present owner would have lived here for years and potentially never discovered it. He'd decided to unseal it, not immediately. He'd thought about it for a week, standing in the guest bedroom, running his hand over the barely perceptible outline, thinking about what it meant to remove something that had been so deliberately concealed. It felt like a violation of a boundary, like he was crossing into territory that the previous owner had specifically marked as off-limits. But it was his house. He'd bought it. The previous owner had no claim on the space anymore. And yet there was something in the deliberateness of the sealing that suggested the previous owner was still present in some way, still protecting something, still maintaining a boundary from beyond the act of ownership transfer. He'd hired a contractor named Paul to do the work. Paul had looked at the wall and had laughed. That's really neat work. Whoever did that didn't want anyone looking through that window. But yeah, I can get through this. You want to see what's on the other side? I want to see the window, Stephen had said. Paul had come back with tools and had carefully cut away the drywall, working methodically, creating clean lines. It had taken 3 hours, and when he'd finished and had knocked away the drywall, there was the window. A rectangular opening about 3 feet by 2 feet, with a frame that looked original to the house, fitted with glass on both sides. Stephen had looked through it into the master bedroom, and the master bedroom had looked back at him through the window. It was that simple. The window opened into the master bedroom on the other side. It would have allowed light to flow between the rooms. It would have created a connection, a visual link between the 2 spaces. And the previous owner had decided that connection wasn't acceptable, had sealed it so thoroughly that the connection was literally impossible. Why would someone do that? Paul had asked, standing beside Stephen, both of them looking through the newly revealed window. I don't know, Stephen had said. Paul had finished the work, repainting the wall around the newly exposed window, making sure the frame was secure. And then he'd left, and Stephen had been alone with the window. This connection between rooms that had been so deliberately severed. He'd called the previous owner directly. Jennifer had provided a phone number, reluctantly, noting that it was unusual to contact sellers after closing. The previous owner's name was Robert. He answered on the 3rd ring, and Stephen had explained the situation. I found a sealed window in the guest bedroom, Stephen had said. It was bricked over and covered with drywall. I had it unsealed. I'm trying to understand why it was sealed in the first place. There had been a very long silence, so long that Stephen had thought the call had disconnected. I sealed that window, Robert had said, finally. His voice sounded older than Stephen expected, tired. Why? Because it needed to be sealed. But why? What was the problem with the window? There wasn't a problem with the window. The window was fine, but the connection it created wasn't acceptable. What do you mean, the connection wasn't acceptable? Robert had sighed. I lived in that house for 15 years. I was married for 8 of those years. The guest bedroom was my wife's bedroom. The master bedroom was mine. We had difficulties. The window between them created a connection that we couldn't maintain. I could see her room from my room. She could see my room from hers. It became impossible to live like that, with that visual connection always present. So I sealed it. Stephen had stood in the guest bedroom, looking through the newly exposed window into the master bedroom, understanding what Robert was saying without fully understanding it. You sealed it because you didn't want to see into her room. I sealed it because we couldn't look at each other across that space anymore. And once I sealed it, once I couldn't see into her room, things were better. It was easier. We could pretend we were in separate houses rather than separate rooms in the same house. But you sealed it so thoroughly, Stephen had said. You didn't just close the window or hang curtains. You sealed it completely. You covered it so well that nobody would have known it was there. I sealed it because I didn't want it to tempt me to reopen it, Robert had said. Every time I was tempted to unseal it, to look through it, to see into her room again, I had to confront the fact that the window was sealed, that I'd chosen that. And over time, I stopped being tempted. Are you still married to her? No. We divorced 5 years ago. She moved to Virginia. I sold the house, "Do you regret sealing the window?" Robert had been quiet for a very long time. "I regret a lot of things," he'd said finally. "But I don't regret sealing the window. The window was a way of connecting across a distance that shouldn't have been crossed. Sealing it was a way of respecting that distance, even if I couldn't admit why at the time." After hanging up, Stephen had stood in the guest bedroom looking through the window into the master bedroom. The window was open now, the connection was restored, and he could see that the master bedroom was empty. A bed frame with a mattress still wrapped in plastic, a dresser without drawers, blank walls waiting for his decisions about what to do with the space. He'd closed the curtains on the window, not all the way, just enough to break the line of sight, to restore some boundary between the two rooms. He'd left it that way for 3 days, and then he'd opened the curtains again, and then he'd closed them. He'd repeated this pattern several times, trying to determine which state felt right, connected or separated, open or closed. In the end, he'd left the curtains open. He'd left the window exposed, the connection restored, even though he didn't fully understand what he was restoring or why it mattered. He'd understood, though, that Robert's sealing of the window had been an act of desperation, a way of imposing a boundary when the emotional boundary had failed. And that unsealing it was accepting that some connections, once broken, couldn't be fully healed, but that pretending they never existed was its own kind of pain. He'd thought about calling Jennifer back to let her know what he'd discovered. He'd thought about writing to Robert, but he'd done neither. He'd simply lived in the house with the window open, letting the light flow between the rooms, accepting the connection that the previous owner had tried so hard to sever. In the evenings, he'd sit in the master bedroom and look through the window into the guest bedroom. Or he'd sit in the guest bedroom and look through the window into the master bedroom. And he'd think about Robert and his wife, living in separate rooms, looking across a space they could see but couldn't bridge. He'd think about the decision to seal the window, the act of sealing it, the years of living with a wall where a connection used to be. And he'd think about the fact that he'd chosen to unseal it, that he'd chosen to restore what had been broken, that he'd chosen to accept the connection even though he didn't know what it would cost him. By December, he'd furnished both rooms. The guest bedroom had a bed now, a dresser, a chair by the window. The master bedroom had a bed, a nightstand, a lamp. Both rooms were functional, separate, but connected by the window. He'd put curtains on the window, curtains that could be opened or closed, and he'd made a choice to leave them open most of the time. One evening, a real estate agent had called asking if he was interested in selling. "Not yet," he'd said. "Good property," the agent had said. "Nice cul-de-sac, quiet neighborhood." Stephen had thought about the sealed window, about Robert's marriage, about the decision to conceal something so deliberately. "It's a good house," he'd said. "I'm planning to stay." And he'd meant it. He'd meant that he was going to live with the window, with the connection, with the choice that Robert had made and that Stephen had unmade. He'd meant that he was going to accept the inheritance, the sealed window, the story it contained, the possibility of connection that it represented, and he was going to transform it into something that didn't require sealing, something that could be looked at without pain. Or at least, he was going to try. The window remained open. The connection remained restored, and Stephen lived between them, accepting what the previous owner had refused, understanding what the previous owner had concealed, and choosing every day to leave it visible, to leave it accessible, to leave it open. Natalie Brooks had moved to the Hollow in western North Carolina because she needed to disappear. Not disappear in any literal sense, not witness protection or identity change, but disappear in the way that moving to a remote place allows you to disappear from the life you'd been living. She was 36 years old, divorced, and had quit her job as a marketing executive at a firm in Charlotte. The job had been good, salary that allowed her to save money, benefits, the kind of career trajectory that other people envied. But it had also been suffocating. The work was meaningless in a specific way that only corporate work can be meaningless, strategically empty, designed to generate profit without creating value. And after the divorce from Michael, after the division of assets and the awkward process of untangling a life that had been thoroughly combined, she'd realized she didn't want to go back to any of it. She'd rented a small house in a hollow, 20 miles from the nearest town, a structure that had once been someone's weekend place and was now available for short-term rental. The hollow was remote, accessed by a narrow road that climbed steeply through dense forest, surrounded by mountains that seemed to contain and protect the space. The rental was cheap, the landlord was absent, and the solitude was absolute. Natalie had moved in with minimal possessions, had set up her laptop for the remote work she'd begun accepting, contract-based marketing consulting, the kind of work she could do from anywhere as long as she had internet. She'd chosen a life of intentional simplicity, and she'd tried not to think about what she was running from. The first thing she'd noticed about the Hollow was the porch lights. Every house in the Hollow left their porch lights on, not just in the evening, all night. She'd moved in on a Tuesday in late October, had arrived at her rental in the afternoon, had unpacked and settled in. And as darkness fell, which happened early in the mountains, the sun disappearing before 5 o'clock, she'd noticed that every house visible from her location had turned on their porch lights. The house directly across the road from her had a porch light that came on at dusk. The house 100 yards down the hollow had a porch light, a motion-activated floodlight that illuminated the entire front of the structure. The house further up the road, barely visible through the trees, had lights on its porch. Every structure Natalie could see, without exception, had exterior lighting that stayed on through the entire night. It was such a universal practice that at first Natalie had assumed there was a logical explanation. Maybe the Hollow was in an area with wild animal problems, and people kept lights on to deter predators. Maybe there was a local ordinance or a neighborhood watch program or some agreement among residents about exterior security lighting. But the more she observed, the more the behavior seemed deliberate, in a way that went beyond practical security measures. The lights stayed on regardless of whether anyone was home. She'd noticed, after a few days, when one of her neighbors, a woman who lived 2 houses down, had left for what appeared to be an extended trip. The woman's car had been gone for 4 days. The house had clearly been empty, but the porch lights had remained on the entire time. No one had turned them off. No one had considered leaving them off as a practical measure to save electricity while the house was unoccupied. Natalie had started keeping track, had noted which houses had porch lights, how bright they were, whether they had any variation in the way they were managed. By the end of her first week, she'd documented that every single structure in the Hollow had exterior lighting that remained on through the night. The lights ranged in intensity from subtle to harsh, but they were universal. She'd asked her landlord about it. She'd called the number provided in the rental paperwork and had asked casually about the neighborhood custom regarding porch lights. "Everyone keeps them on," the landlord had said. His name was Bob, and he lived in the nearest town. "It's just how the hollow is." "But why?" Natalie had asked. "It seems like it would get expensive to run porch lights all night." "It's not about expense," Bob had said. "It's about keeping the hollow visible, keeping it occupied looking. It's what people do." Occupied looking to whom? Bob had been quiet for a moment. "Just what people do in the hollow. You'll understand soon enough." Natalie had found this response unsatisfying but not particularly alarming. Bob's tone suggested it wasn't his job to explain Appalachian customs to outsiders. She'd let the matter drop and had continued to observe. What struck her most, as she'd settled into her rental and had begun her new routine of remote work and solitude, was the consistency of it. The lights didn't flicker. They didn't vary in brightness based on time of night or season or anything else. They simply remained on, a constant illumination that made the hollow visible in the darkness. At night, when Natalie would look out her windows, she could see the lit porches of her neighbors, could see the structures they'd built, could see the occupied spaces that the lights proclaimed. In early November, she'd driven to the nearest town, a place called Mercy, population about 300, and had asked around about the porch light custom. She'd mentioned it to the woman at the general store, had asked in a casual way if it was a common practice in the area. The woman had looked at her with a particular kind of expression, part recognition, part caution. "You're in one of the hollows?" "Yes, about 20 miles from here." "The porch lights stay on," the woman had said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, why is that?" The woman had paused before answering, seeming to decide how much to explain. "It's because of what comes in the darkness. The people in the hollows, they know not to be dark at night. You keep lights on, the hollows stay visible, and you're safer." "Safer from what?" "From things that don't like light," the woman had said. She'd turned away to help another customer, and the conversation had ended. Natalie had driven back to her rental thinking about what things that don't like light might mean. It sounded superstitious, the kind of thing people said when they wanted to explain behavior without actually explaining it. But there was something in the woman's tone that suggested she wasn't speaking metaphorically. There was something she believed in, some threat she thought was real. She'd decided to research it. She'd spent an evening online, searching for information about Appalachian folklore, about customs related to lights and night safety, about the hollows specifically. She'd found scattered references to old beliefs about things that lived in the mountains, stories that had been passed down but were now mostly treated as folklore. She'd found a blog written by someone who'd grown up in the Appalachian region that mentioned how people in rural areas often kept lights on at night because darkness in the mountains was dangerous. The blog post didn't specify what the danger was exactly, just that it was a known thing, something people accepted without questioning. By mid-November, as the weather grew colder and the nights became longer, Natalie had begun to understand that the porch lights were not casual or optional. She'd observed that when people left their homes, they left the lights on. When people came home, they didn't turn the lights off. The lights remained on continuously, as if they were performing a function that was too important to interrupt. She'd asked one of her neighbors directly. The neighbor's name was Ruth, and she lived in the house directly across from Natalie's rental. Ruth was probably in her 60s, with gray hair she wore in a braid and the weathered skin of someone who spent time outside. Natalie had walked over one morning and had asked if she had a moment to talk. "The porch lights," Natalie had said. "Everyone in the hollow keeps them on all night. I was wondering why." Ruth had looked at her with an expression that suggested she'd been expecting this question. "You're not from here," Ruth had said. It wasn't a question. "No, I moved here from Charlotte a few weeks ago." "And the lights bothered you?" "Not bothered exactly, just curious about why everyone does it." Ruth had looked out at the hollow, at the visible houses, at the porch lights that even in daylight you could see were still on. The hollow is safer when it's visible, when people can see it, when lights show that it's occupied and present, it's safe. When it gets dark, when the lights aren't on, that's when things move. What kind of things? Ruth had been quiet for a long moment. The kind of things that live in the mountains, the kind of things that come down into the hollows when it gets dark and the places aren't showing their lights. If you're dark, if your porch doesn't have a light on, you're inviting attention. You're making yourself a target. A target for what? For things that don't want to be seen, things that move better in darkness. Natalie had tried to press for more detail, but Ruth had excused herself, saying she had work to do. But she'd left Natalie with a clear message. The lights were protection. They were a defense. They were a signal to whatever moved in the darkness that this space was occupied, visible, defended. Over the following weeks, as the weather turned colder and winter approached, Natalie had begun to notice other behaviors that seemed related to the porch lights. People didn't stay outside after dark. She'd observe the hollow in late afternoon, and there would be movement, people outside doing chores, working on property, visible in the declining light. But as soon as the sun began to set, activity would cease. People would go inside their houses. The hollow would empty of human presence, leaving only the porch lights to demonstrate that the space was occupied. She'd also noticed that people seemed particularly anxious during times of weather change. In late November, when a significant snowstorm had moved through, the electricity had flickered several times. Each time it had flickered, threatening to cut the power, she'd noticed her neighbors coming outside in the darkness to check their lights, to make sure they were still functioning. One of them had even come to her door to ask if her light was still on, seeming genuinely worried when she'd confirmed that the power had flickered, but the light remained functioning. By early December, Natalie had begun to understand the collective anxiety that bound the hollow together. It wasn't irrational fear, or if it was irrational fear that had been passed down through generations, embedded in the culture, accepted as simply the price of living in the mountains. The porch lights weren't decoration or casual security measures. They were essential. They were the primary defense against something that the community had apparently learned long ago to be afraid of. She'd also started to feel the weight of not participating. Her rental house had a porch light. It had come with the structure, but she hadn't turned it on since moving in. The bulb had been there, functioning, but she'd simply never bothered. The rental was in a covered area, and she'd assumed that exterior lighting wasn't necessary for her safety. But as November progressed and she'd learned more about the custom, she'd begun to feel increasingly aware that her dark porch was an anomaly. When she'd look out her windows at night, She'd see the lit porches of her neighbors, and she'd see her own porch, dark, unlit, conspicuously absent from the network of light that seemed to protect the hollow. One evening in early December, as she'd been working at her laptop, she'd heard something. It was difficult to describe, not quite a sound, more like a presence that registered in her awareness. Something moving near her house, something that seemed to pause when it encountered the edge of her property. Something that, when she'd looked out the window, had been invisible in the darkness beyond the reach of any exterior light. She'd turned on the porch light. The moment the light had come on, whatever had been outside had retreated. She couldn't see anything specific, couldn't identify what it had been, but the quality of the darkness had changed. The sense of presence had moved away, and the porch light, once illuminated, had brought a sense of security that Natalie hadn't expected to feel. She'd left the light on that night, and the next night, and every night after that. As the weeks passed, as she'd settled more fully into the hollow, Natalie had understood that she was being assimilated into a practice that was older than she was, deeper than individual choice, essential to survival in this place. The porch light was no longer a curiosity to her. It was a necessity. It was the way you declared that your space was occupied, defended, protected. It was the way you participated in the collective agreement that held the hollow together. She'd also learned, through observation and careful attention, that there were consequences for not maintaining the lights. One of the houses further down the hollow had gone dark one evening. The porch light had burned out, apparently, and the owner hadn't replaced it immediately. For 2 nights, that house had sat in darkness while every other structure in the hollow had maintained its light. On the 3rd night, the owner had apparently realized the bulb was out and had replaced it. But in those 2 nights of darkness, something had happened. Natalie hadn't witnessed it directly, but she'd heard from Ruth that the family who lived in that house had experienced disturbance. Things moving around the property, sounds near the structure, the sense of something testing the boundaries of the darkened space. The light had been restored, and the disturbance had ceased. But the message was clear. The lights were not optional. They were the terms of residence in the hollow. By late December, Natalie had fully integrated the porch light into her life. She'd checked the bulb to make sure it was functioning. She'd made sure the fixture was secure. She'd accepted that this light would remain on every night, that the electricity cost was the price of safety, that the illumination was worth whatever it consumed. She'd also begun to understand what she'd been running from in Charlotte, what she'd been escaping when she'd moved to the hollow. She'd been running from a life that was hollow in a different way, a life of meaningless work and disconnected relationships, and the kind of emptiness that comes from not being part of anything larger than yourself. The hollow in North Carolina was remote and isolated, but it was also a community. The porch lights represented something that her life in Charlotte hadn't had. A collective agreement about what was necessary to survive, a shared understanding about threat and defense, a unified practice that bound people together. She'd built a life in the hollow that was small but real. She'd established routines. She'd built relationships with her neighbors. She'd become part of the community that understood, without explanation, why the lights had to remain on. One evening in late December, as she'd looked out her window at the porch lights glowing in the darkness, Natalie had thought about what might be out there in the mountains, moving in the darkness beyond the reach of the lights. She'd thought about what her neighbors had learned to fear, what their ancestors had learned to defend against, what the darkness in the Appalachian Mountains concealed. And she'd understood that she didn't need to know the specifics. Understanding the threat wasn't necessary. What was necessary was participating in the defense. What was necessary was keeping her light on, maintaining her part of the collective illumination, contributing to the network of visibility that held back the darkness. She'd turned off her laptop and had made tea and had sat on her porch, in the light, looking out at the hollow. Every house visible from her location had its porch light on. The hollow was visible, occupied, defended. The night pressed against the boundary of light, but it couldn't penetrate it. Natalie had understood that she would never leave this place. She'd come to the hollow to disappear, and she had. But she'd also discovered that disappearing meant finding a community, finding a purpose, finding a place where her presence mattered. The porch light was her declaration of residence. It was her contribution to the collective defense. It was her agreement to stay, to maintain the light, to keep watch in the darkness. The light remained on, every night, all night. And Natalie remained in the hollow, part of the community, part of the agreement, part of the illumination that held back the mountain's darkness. Claire Whitaker had been living in Harlan County for 8 months before she understood that her neighbors' houses ended at the tree line. It wasn't something anyone had told her directly. It was something she'd learned by watching, by noticing what wasn't said, by recognizing the shape of silence in the way people moved through their own property. She'd bought the old Summers place in March, just after the divorce was finalized. 3 acres of hillside property with a farmhouse that needed work. Needed everything, really. The roof had patches of missing shingles. The porch sagged on one side, and the interior smelled like decades of wood smoke and something else, something organic and faintly acrid that no amount of opening windows seemed to shift. The realtor had been vague about why the price was so low for the land and the structure. "Needs updating," she'd said, her voice carrying the particular tone of someone who was being professionally diplomatic about something deeper. Folks around here like their privacy. Claire had taken that to mean the property was isolated, which had appealed to her. She'd left Atlanta after the divorce, after months of mediation and division of assets, and the unbearable awkwardness of running into her ex-husband at the coffee shop where they used to go together on Sunday mornings. She'd needed distance, not just emotional distance, but geographic distance, the kind that made it impossible to accidentally encounter the life she'd built with someone else. The Summers place, down a county road that curved through national forest land, surrounded by steep, wooded terrain and accessible only by a single-lane drive, had seemed perfect, remote, isolated, hers. The neighbors were polite enough in the way of rural people, which meant they were cordial without being warm, interested without being intrusive. Bud Collar lived to her east, with 100 acres that climbed toward the ridge. His property was meticulously maintained, the pastures mowed on a regular schedule, the fences intact and painted white, the house itself a modest brick structure set back from the road with a small barn beside it. Bud was in his early 60s, she guessed, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his entire life outside. And he had the particular stance of Appalachian men, slightly forward-leaning, ready, observant. His wife, Marla, had brought over a casserole on Claire's first weekend, tuna noodle, homemade, still warm in a glass dish, with a lid that had a ceramic knob shaped like a vegetable. Marla was smaller than Bud, softer, with gray blonde hair that she wore in a braid, and a way of looking at people that suggested she was assessing whether they could be trusted. Bud had nodded from the porch, one hand in his jacket pocket, the other holding a cup of coffee, and said, "Welcome to the Hollow." That was the first time Claire had heard the term, the Hollow. Not the valley, not the property, not Harlan County. The Hollow, as if it were a specific place with a specific character, something that already existed before she arrived and would continue existing after she left. The Hendersons were to the north, behind the tree line, though she could see their roof from the upper pasture on clear days, a gray, shingled, ranch-style house that looked like it had been built sometime in the 1970s and never substantially updated. Robert and Sue Ellen Henderson. She learned their names from Marla, who'd mentioned them casually, the way you mention neighbors you know but don't see often. Their daughter came by once with her children, visiting from Knoxville, where she worked in some corporate capacity that Sue Ellen had mentioned with a tone of mingled pride and confusion. The grandchildren were rambunctious and bored by the rural setting, and when Claire had offered to show them around the property line, pointing out where her deed technically extended into the wooded areas, Sue Ellen had seemed almost embarrassed. "We stay close to the house, mostly," Sue Ellen had said carefully, gathering her daughter's attention with a subtle eye contact. "The kids don't know the property like they should. They're growing up in the city, different from how it was when we were young." That comment had struck Claire as odd then, particularly the phrase, "like they should," which suggested an expectation of knowledge that should have been inherited, should have been taught. But she'd been too busy with contractors and permits and learning which local businesses would return her calls to think much about it. Her focus had been on the practical, getting the roof repaired before the autumn rains, having the well tested, finding someone to clear the fallen branches that covered much of the property and made walking difficult. October came, and with it, the first real evening, when the temperature dropped enough to make the early darkness feel substantive. The sun was setting before 5 o'clock now, and the quality of light changed, became amber, then copper, then a purple-gray that seemed to drain color from everything it touched. Claire had been working in her kitchen, scraping old wallpaper from above the stove with a metal putty knife, making a particular scratching sound that had become her soundtrack for the renovation. Through the window above the sink, which faced east toward Bud's property, she noticed movement. Bud was walking his property line at dusk. She could see him clearly in the fading light, moving deliberately along the eastern fence, a rifle across his arm, held not in a hunting posture, but more like a walking stick, something to carry rather than something to use. She'd never heard him mention hunting. In fact, in the conversations she'd had with him at the property line, he'd never mentioned what he did with his days, how he occupied his time, or what he did with the 100 acres he owned. He was a man of minimal speech, and what he did say came slowly, as if each word was being selected from a limited vocabulary of practical communication. He was walking methodically, the way a man walks a perimeter when he's checking something specific. His eyes were moving, not into his property, but along the boundary itself, where his land met hers, where the open pasture gave way to the tree line. He was checking something, looking for something, making sure something was still there. He didn't walk into the woods. He stayed exactly at the boundary, where the open pasture met the tree line, never stepping into the shadowed forest even though there was plenty of deadfall there, branches and small trees that had fallen and now littered the ground in the way of old forests. When he reached the northern corner where her property touched his, where the fence posts marked the official boundary, he turned with precise footwork and walked back toward his house without looking at her woods at all. He didn't look at her either, though she was standing in the lit window. He simply walked back the way he'd come, the rifle still across his arm, and disappeared into the gathering darkness. The next evening, just after sunset, she saw Robert Henderson doing the same thing. Same deliberate pace, same rifle, same refusal to enter the forest, even to cut firewood from the abundant deadfall she could see from her window in his property. He moved along his boundary with the same methodical quality, checking the fence posts, running his hand along the wire, then turning and walking back the way he'd come. It took him perhaps 20 minutes. Then he went back inside his house, and Claire could see the kitchen light come on. That was when she'd started to pay attention, when the pattern became visible. Claire had asked about it casually at the dollar store in Whitesburg, where she'd started buying groceries because the checkout line was short and the cashier, a woman named Diane who seemed to know everyone, could answer questions about plumbers and electricians and which restaurants were still open on Sundays. "Your neighbors walk their property lines at dusk?" Diane had repeated, pausing in her scanning of items. She was holding a box of granola bars, looking at it as if it might contain the answer to something more complicated than just pricing. "That's just how folks do things around here. Checking the boundaries." "Checking for what?" Claire had asked, hearing the note of curiosity in her own voice, the slightly too eager tone of someone from outside trying to understand local customs. Diane had looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were pale blue, and she had the particular expression of someone who was deciding how much to tell. "Just checking," she'd said finally, resuming her scanning. "Making sure the boundaries are good, making sure everything is where it should be." That was the Appalachian answer to almost everything. Vague, protective, final. It was a way of saying, "I'm not going to explain this, and you should understand that I'm not going to explain this, and that my refusal to explain is itself an answer." By November, Claire had learned that this was not unique to Bud Collar or Robert Henderson. Every evening, just as dark was settling completely, that precise moment between dusk and full night, when the sky went purple-gray and the ridgeline disappeared into darkness, the men came out. Not everyone, every night, but enough nights that there was a pattern. Bud on some evenings, usually Tuesdays and Thursdays. Robert almost every evening, moving with a consistency that suggested obligation rather than preference. Tom Mackey from the property south of her, a man she'd rarely spoken to, but who drove a red pickup truck and had the reputation, according to Marla, of keeping to himself. Tom would move along his fence line with a flashlight that he kept pointed down, not toward the woods, but at the ground itself, as if he was reading something there. Instructions written in soil, perhaps. Maps written in moonlight. They never walked into their own woods after dark. Not once. Not in any configuration. Not on evenings when she was watching. And not on the evenings when she assumed they must be doing it without her observation. The pattern was absolute and universal among the men who owned property in the hollow. Claire had begun timing her own evening walks to test this. She'd start from her porch after 5 o'clock, deliberately heading toward the tree line on her property, and she could feel it, a shift in attention from the neighboring houses. Not overt. No one called out or appeared or threatened anything. But a quality of watching would settle over the hollow, a shift in the atmosphere, like a room getting colder when someone opens a door to outside. It was the same feeling she'd had in Atlanta when she'd walked alone to her car in a parking garage at night. That specific awareness that she was being observed for safety reasons, as if the watching itself was protective, as if someone, somewhere, was making sure nothing went wrong. She'd never made it more than 50 feet into the woods after dark. There was no physical barrier, no line she crossed where something stopped her. It was more subtle than that. It was the sense that she was trespassing on a boundary that existed not on deeds or surveys, but in the understanding of the land itself, in something that was older than documents and more absolute than law. The local men weren't afraid of their own property during the day. She'd seen Bud and Robert working deep into their woods, cutting fallen branches, marking trees with colored tape, maintaining the forest floor in ways that suggested stewardship rather than use. But they never crossed into that territory once the sun was down. Not once. Not for any reason. In mid-November, Claire had driven to the county records office in Whitesburg and pulled property deeds going back 50 years. The building was a concrete structure that smelled like photocopier toner and old paper. The records clerk had helped her navigate the filing system, pointing her toward the drawers that held the relevant property information. The Collars had owned their land since 1987, the Hendersons since 1992. Before that, there were other families, Mackeys, Colemans, a family named Price. The deeds went back to the 1950s in most cases, with sporadic transfers and name changes. But the properties themselves had been held continuously by Appalachian families for generations before deeds were even formally recorded. She'd found references to transfers from heirs of previous owners, suggesting that the same families had held land here for decades, perhaps longer, before selling to the current residents. She'd asked the records clerk, an older man with worn glasses and fingers stained with some kind of ink, if he knew anything about the property history. The Summers place, he'd said, looking up from the deed he was helping her locate. That's been through a lot of hands. Sits different than the other properties. Most folks don't stay long. 2 years, sometimes 3. Then they sell to someone else or just move away. Hard to say exactly what the pattern is. Why? Claire had asked. Why don't they stay? The clerk had adjusted his glasses and considered the question. Hard to say. Some land just sits different, has a different feeling to it. The people who come in here to buy and sell, they don't talk about it much, but you can tell. They're not comfortable. They need to move on. That was the Appalachian answer to everything. Vague, protective, final. It was a way of creating boundaries with words that said almost nothing. In December, deep in the cold now, the ground sometimes hard with frost, Claire had stopped trying to walk her property after dark. It wasn't that she believed anything was actually wrong. She didn't believe in supernatural explanations. She was a civil engineer by training, used to solving problems with data and measurement. Her worldview was based on things that could be quantified, verified, proven. But she'd learned to listen to the absence of noise, the way the whole hollow seemed to hold its breath when she approached the tree line at night. She'd learned to feel the difference between loneliness and isolation, and her property after dark had the quality of isolation, the sense that something was maintaining distance, not violently, but absolutely, deliberately, with intention. Instead of walking into the woods, she'd begun walking the boundaries at dusk like her neighbors did. She'd started without admitting it to herself. A walk to check the eastern fence because fences sometimes sag under their own weight, and it was good to verify the integrity of the structure. A walk to verify that the property markers were still visible because weather could shift things, and documents were only as good as the markers on the ground. A walk that happened to coincide with the time when the other men were also checking their perimeters, when the watching quality in the hollow had a collective, procedural feel to it. They'd nod at her as they passed at the boundary points. No conversation, no acknowledgement of what they were doing together, but a kind of recognition, an acceptance that she was beginning to understand the rules. Bud had started leaving the casserole dish returned on her porch, clean and dry. Usually the morning after Marla had brought something. It was a small gesture, but it meant that she could use the same dish for baking or returning food herself. It meant she was becoming part of the exchange system that bound the community together. Marla had begun bringing other things: bread wrapped in aluminum foil, a jar of canned peaches from previous years that had the handwritten date on the label. Once a quilt still in the plastic from Walmart, which Claire understood was a gift but had taken off the porch and folded carefully in her linen closet. Not quite ready for that level of welcome, not quite ready to accept that she might be staying long enough to need such things. One evening in late November, just as the purple-gray light was fading and the temperature had dropped enough to make Claire's breath visible in small clouds, she found herself standing at the northwest corner of her property, looking into the thick darkness of the forest. She was wearing a jacket, a navy fleece that had been her ex-husband's, something she'd kept after the divorce because it was comfortable and he didn't ask for it back. And she was alone, having chosen this moment specifically to step outside. Bud was doing the same thing at his boundary point, about 100 yards north. They were separated by the strip of her property that existed between them, and they'd both paused at roughly the same time, both looking into their respective forests. "How long have you lived here?" she'd called across the space, her voice carrying in the cold air, bouncing slightly off the forest wall. Bud had looked at her, then back at his woods, then back at her. He'd taken a moment before answering, and she could see him deciding how much to share, whether this question deserved a full answer or just a dismissal. 8 months, he'd said finally. "That's you. I'm here 37 years. Have you ever walked into those woods after dark?" she'd asked, and she could hear the challenge in her own voice, the skepticism that was still a part of her, the part that believed there had to be a rational explanation. He'd been quiet for a long time. The darkness between them had seemed to deepen, to become less empty. She could hear the sound of wind in the bare branches, the distant call of an owl, the particular silence that falls over the forest when it's fully dark. When he spoke, his voice had been careful, measured the way people speak when they're sharing something sacred or dangerous, something that had to be said exactly right because the meaning depended on the precision of the words. "No," he'd said. "My father didn't. His father didn't. The people before us didn't. It's not about fear, exactly. It's about respect, about knowing what your land is and isn't yours to use, about understanding that ownership is one thing and access is another. "What do you mean, isn't yours?" she'd asked, and now her voice was quieter, less challenging. "I mean," Bud had said slowly, choosing each word as if it were fragile, "that there's land you own that's still somebody else's. The title might say it's yours. The deed might have your name on it. The county records might confirm your ownership, but titles are only good in daylight. At night, the land remembers who it belonged to before the deeds, before the fences, before the families moved in and started building houses. And if you go walking in there at night, uninvited, you're trespassing on that memory. You're crossing a boundary that exists in something older than law." Claire had felt something cold move through her then. Not fear, exactly, but recognition. The recognition that she'd been right to stop trying to enter the woods, that the boundary she felt wasn't imaginary or psychological, that her neighbors weren't being superstitious or cautious for no reason. They were being obedient to something older than property law, to something that predated deeds and fences and the legal fiction that you could own land. "What happens if someone doesn't respect that?" she'd asked. "What happens if someone walks into the woods after dark anyway?" Bud had turned to look at her directly then, and in the last of the purple light, she could see his face was grave. His eyes were dark, and there was something in his expression that suggested he'd answered this question before, or been asked it before, or knew what the answer meant. "They don't last long in the hollow," he'd said. "They sell to someone else, move away, find jobs somewhere else, get transferred to different states. The land doesn't hold them. Their claims don't stick. It's like the place itself rejects them, slowly, over time, until they understand they're not welcome and they leave. Some people are smart enough to figure it out quickly. Some people take longer, but the land always wins eventually." "The land," she'd repeated, hearing the oddness of it, the way it sounded almost like a living thing when Bud said it. "The land," he'd repeated, "and whatever it remembers." After that conversation, Claire had stopped asking questions. She'd stopped trying to understand the mechanism or find a rational explanation. She'd walked her boundaries every evening at dusk, like the other property owners did. She'd learned the rhythm of it, the way the hollow held its breath at the precise moment the sun touched the western ridge, how the atmosphere shifted, how the watching would settle over the space like a benediction or a judgment. She'd learned to recognize the moment when the purple-gray light was just starting to fade, when the forest seemed to be gathering itself, and that was when she would walk. She'd learned the names of all the men who did this, not just Bud and Robert, but Tom Mackey and Dennis Albright from 2 hollows over, and old Pete Coleman, who was probably in his 70s and still walked his boundary with the same careful attention the younger men used. She'd learned to feel the difference between her property during daylight and the woods beyond the tree line after dark. By day, they were hers, subject to her deed, available to her labor, within her control. She could walk there, cut wood, clear branches, do whatever work needed doing. By night, they belonged to something else, something older, something that hadn't given permission and wouldn't. She'd learned that this wasn't unique to her property or specific to some supernatural phenomenon that only affected this particular hollow. Every family in the hollow maintained the same boundary. Every property had a line you didn't cross after dark. Every man walked his perimeter in the purple-gray light, not as ritual, but as acknowledgement. An agreement renewed every evening. We know what's ours and what isn't. We know what time of day that line shifts. We know that daylight permits things that night forbids. We respect it, and because we respect it, the land tolerates us. In January, a new family had bought property 2 hollows over. A young couple from Bristol, both professionals, both skeptical of local customs and ways of doing things. He was an accountant or something in finance, and she worked in marketing for a hospital system. They'd posted no trespassing signs on every boundary post and installed security lights that turned the night into a kind of artificial day. They seemed determined to exercise full dominion over their land at all hours, to claim absolute ownership in a way that respected no local tradition or inherited understanding. They'd mentioned to someone at the general store that they thought the whole boundary walking thing was charming local color, but ultimately superstitious nonsense. Claire had watched from a distance, the way you watch someone approach the edge of a cliff in fog. She'd wanted to warn them, but she didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. And there was something else, too. Something in the Appalachian Code that meant you didn't warn outsiders. You let them learn for themselves. They lasted 4 months. The wife had had a panic attack in the driveway one night, standing under one of the security lights, and refused to stay after dark. She'd started sleeping at her mother's house in Bristol, driving in every morning. The husband had driven his truck into a ravine one evening. Not a fatal crash, but close, and he'd been drinking. And when they'd pulled him out, he'd been crying, saying over and over that he didn't know why he'd turned the wheel. The wheel just turned, and his hands wouldn't obey his intentions. He'd mentioned to someone at the hospital that he'd been having strange dreams, where he was walking in the woods behind his property, and there were people there, not threatening, but present, and they were looking at him like he didn't belong. He'd stopped sleeping well. He'd mentioned his job might be transferring him to Charlotte anyway. By May, the property was back on the market, and he'd taken a transfer that no one knew he'd applied for, and he left the state without a forwarding address. Claire had watched this and learned the deeper lesson of Appalachian caution. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't superstition or rural ignorance or the residual effect of mountain isolation. It was survival. It was the accumulated wisdom of generations who'd learned to live alongside something that predated their arrival, something that tolerated their presence only if they respected its boundaries. The people who lasted in these hollows were the ones who understood that ownership was a daytime privilege, that night revealed older claims, and that the land itself had boundaries that no deed could erase. She'd learned to stop thinking of herself as the owner of her 3 acres and started thinking of herself instead as someone permitted to use certain portions of it during certain hours in certain ways. She'd learned that respect meant recognizing what you didn't own, and that the hollows were maintained by an ancient agreement between people and the land they'd built homes on. It was an agreement written in the evening walks, in the refusal to enter the woods after dark, in the casual nods between neighbors at the boundary points, in the understanding that was never quite spoken because speaking it too directly might break something. Every evening, as the purple light began to fade, she walked her boundary, not checking for trespassers, not checking for animals or problems or anything practical, checking for permission, confirming that the land still allowed her to be there, that her claim was still valid, that she understood the rules, and would continue to obey them. The neighbors had started inviting her to suppers, not formal invitations, but the casual kind where Marla would say, "We're having some people over Saturday," and Claire would understand she was included. She'd learned the names of people who lived in neighboring hollows, the genealogies that connected families across ridgelines, the history of which families had lasted and which had moved on. She'd learned that the people who stayed were the ones who learned quickly about boundaries, who understood that the land was older than deeds, and that some borders couldn't be crossed, and that the price of belonging was respect for the things you couldn't own. By late fall of her second year, Claire had stopped thinking of leaving. She'd accepted a contract with a consulting firm in Lexington, doing structural assessments for county buildings, and she could do most of the work remotely from an office she'd set up in what used to be the Summers Place's formal dining room. She'd replaced the rotted porch, patched the roof, painted the interior in neutral colors that let the structure breathe. The house had stopped being a refuge from her old life and had become simply her life, her place. The land she was permitted to use during daylight, and the boundary she walked at night, where the purple-gray light made time feel suspended, and the watching of the neighbors felt less like scrutiny and more like fellowship. The kinship of people who understood something about the world that couldn't be explained, but only lived within. She'd never asked what the land remembered. She'd learned that asking was its own kind of violation. But sometimes, when she stood at the tree line during the day, she could feel the history pressing against the boundary. Something older than deeds, older than property law, older than the families who'd settled here and built homes and tried to claim the earth itself. The weight of all those generations who'd walked here before the fences were built, before the survey markers were placed, before the county records office started keeping track of ownership. The land had been here first. The memory of who'd walked it before deeds existed, before property law, before the state decided to carve it up into parcels and sell it to settlers. That memory didn't fade with sunset. It only became more present, more absolute, more unwilling to be crossed. Claire understood now. Everyone in the hollow understood. You could own the daylight. You could claim the cleared spaces. You could build houses and cut fields and mark boundaries with wire and posts. You could put your name on a deed and pay taxes and convince yourself that you had dominion over the land. But when night came, the land reclaimed what it had always been. And if you were smart, if you were going to last, if you wanted to survive in the hollow, you acknowledged it. You walked your perimeter at dusk. You didn't cross the tree line after dark. You lived in the agreement between people and place, between what was permitted and what was forbidden, between the ownership that day allowed and the ancient claims that night revealed. You didn't walk your land at night. None of you did. And that was how you survived in the hollow. That was how you became part of something that was larger than yourself, older than your deed, and more absolute than any law the county could record. Lucas Brennan had lived in Millbrook, Nebraska for 6 weeks before he understood that the town had a schedule. It wasn't obvious at first. He'd moved here because of the job, a position as a structural engineer with a consulting firm that had operations in a half-dozen small towns across the Great Plains. The work was steady, the pay adequate, and it got him out of Denver, which was what he'd needed after the separation. His ex-wife had kept the house, the car, and what felt like his capacity to be comfortable in spaces where they'd built a life together. Millbrook, population 2,847, seemed far enough removed from all of that. The town was the kind of place that existed in the margins of America. Long, wide streets that had been designed for more people than currently lived there. A main drag with empty storefronts interspersed with businesses that had managed to survive. A water tower and grain elevator that dominated the skyline. The houses were well maintained for the most part, built in the early 20th century, with wide porches and mature trees. The streets had names like Elm and Walnut and Grant. The speed limit was 25 miles per hour. Nothing about Millbrook suggested anything unusual. He'd rented a house on Spruce Street, a 3-bedroom Victorian converted into a single-family residence by someone with more optimism than skill. The floors were uneven, the plumbing occasional, and the heating system was an ancient radiator that clanged and groaned like a living thing. But it was affordable, and the landlord, a man named Harold Vickers, who owned half the rental properties in town, had asked minimal questions and hadn't required references. Lucas had signed a 6-month lease, bought used furniture from estate sales, and tried not to think about the fact that his marriage had lasted longer than he planned to stay anywhere now. Work kept him occupied. The job was to assess the structural integrity of public buildings across 5 counties, the high school in Millbrook, the county courthouse in Hastings, the water department buildings in smaller towns. It was competent work, well paid, and it required enough attention that he could avoid thinking about anything else. He'd drive out in the morning, spend the day taking measurements and photographs, and return to his empty house in the evening. The town itself didn't require much engagement. He ate breakfast at the diner on Main Street, coffee and eggs, always the same order. He bought groceries at the Super Saver. He gassed up at the station on Highway 34. He nodded at people and exchanged minimal pleasantries. This was how small towns worked. You became part of the landscape through simple repetition and absence of threat. It was in the 3rd week, on an evening in late October, that he first noticed the doors. He'd been driving back to his house around 5:45 p.m., which was relatively early because the weather had turned cold and he'd finished his assessment of the middle school ahead of schedule. The sun was already setting. It set earlier each day as fall deepened into winter, and the streets were quiet in the way of small towns when people were finishing dinner or heading home. He'd noticed, driving slowly down Spruce Street toward his house, that people were beginning to lock their doors. Not unusual in itself, people locked doors, but the synchronization was odd. He'd watched as he passed the Hendersons' house and saw John Henderson turn the deadbolt at the front door. As he passed the next house, an older woman he'd seen in the grocery store was locking her door. The next house, the same thing. Front doors closing, locks engaging, the small metallic sound that even from the street seemed audible in the quiet. He'd checked his dashboard clock, 5:47 p.m. It was probably coincidence. People locked their doors at roughly the same time in the evening. Dinner was finishing. Dark was falling. It made sense, but something about the timing bothered him. The precision of it. The fact that he'd seen it happen at nearly the same moment across multiple houses. Over the next week, he'd paid attention. Every evening, around 5:45 to 5:50 p.m., the doors started locking. He'd begun noting the time specifically, and it was remarkably consistent. Not exact, There was a 5-minute window. But within that window, every single house he'd observed had engaged their front door lock. Some residents engaged back doors as well. He'd seen people moving through their houses, checking windows, making sure things were secure. By the end of the second week, he'd become obsessed with timing it. He'd sit in his house, watching the clock, then drive slowly through different neighborhoods to observe. East Millbrook, West Millbrook, the streets near Maine that had older houses and more activity. Every evening, 5:45 to 5:50 p.m., the doors locked. It was like watching a single organism with hundreds of limbs all moving in synchronization. He'd asked about it casually at the diner. "I noticed people seem to lock up pretty early around here." The waitress, a woman named Carol, who'd been there long enough to know everyone, had paused while refilling his coffee. "What do you mean?" "Just that everyone seems to lock their doors around the same time in the evening. Early, like right after dark." She'd resumed pouring. "People like to be secure, but it's all at the same time. Almost exactly." Carol had set the pot down and looked at him. She was in her 50s, with a particular way of speaking that suggested she was choosing words carefully. "Lucas, around here people just know what time to lock their doors. It's what you do. But why that specific time? Why not earlier? Why not just before bed?" "That's just when you do it," she'd said, and turned to help another customer. It wasn't much to go on, but it was something. People knew, they all knew, independently, the same time to lock their doors. There was no announced rule, no written schedule, no coordination that he could detect. Yet they all did it at essentially the same moment every evening. He'd begun taking walks in the evening, timing his walks to occur just before the locking period. One evening at 5:30 p.m., he'd stood on the corner of Spruce and Elm and watched the neighborhood. People were in their houses. He could see them through lit windows, families finishing dinner, a man reading a newspaper, someone watching television. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested they were waiting for a specific time. Then, around 5:43 p.m., something shifted. People began moving toward their doors, not all at once, but within the next few minutes, almost every house engaged their locks. Some people checked windows, some engaged security bars. One man actually paused on his porch and looked up and down the street before locking the door, not threatening, but observant, watchful. Lucas had felt it then, the quality of anticipation, the sense that people weren't just locking their doors as a routine security measure. They were securing something, against something. He'd asked more questions over the following weeks, carefully, so as not to seem obsessive. He'd asked the clerk at the hardware store if there had been break-ins. She'd said no. He'd asked the waitress at the diner if there was a reason the town had adopted this practice. She'd said that was just how things were. He'd asked his landlord, Harold, if there was a town ordinance or recommendation about locking doors at a specific time. Harold had looked uncomfortable. "It's just what people do here, Lucas. You'll figure it out." But he wasn't figuring it out. The practice made no sense. The town had virtually no crime. The police blotter in the weekly newspaper reported traffic violations and one incident of vandalism from 6 months ago. There was no threat that he could identify. No reason for this coordinated, unspoken, precise locking of doors every evening at essentially the same time. He'd begun researching. He'd gone to the library and looked through old newspapers, trying to find some incident that might explain the practice. A home invasion, a serial crime, anything that would justify this behavior. The newspapers went back to 1987 on microfilm, and he'd looked through them methodically. He'd found no major crime, no incident that would require this kind of coordinated defensive behavior. He'd tried a different approach. He'd asked people directly, approaching them outside the grocery store or at the gas station. I've noticed people lock their doors pretty early in the evening. Is there something I should know about? The responses were remarkably consistent. It's just what you do. Everyone does it. That's how we do things here. You'll understand eventually. Evasive without being hostile. Protective of something. But what? By November, the evenings were darker and colder. Sunset now came before 5 p.m., and the locking period had shifted slightly earlier, now occurring around 5:30 to 5:35 p.m. He'd verified this across multiple evenings and multiple neighborhoods. The time adjusted with the sunset. The doors locked at essentially the same point in the darkness sequence, regardless of what the clock said. When the light reached a certain quality, that moment just before full darkness, when the sky went from purple-gray to black, the doors locked. He'd begun to understand it as a ritual, but one so embedded in the community that no one thought of it as unusual. It was just how you lived in Millbrook. You worked during the day, you ate dinner, and when the light reached that specific quality, you locked your doors, you secured your house, you didn't go outside afterward, you stayed in. One evening, curious and slightly frustrated by the weeks of subtle avoidance from the residents, he'd deliberately gone out at 5:35 p.m., right in the middle of the locking time. He'd walked to the corner store to buy milk and a newspaper, a simple errand that should have taken 5 minutes. But as he'd walked through the town, he'd noticed something unsettling. The streets were emptying. People were hurrying to finish whatever they were doing. A woman was practically running to her house. A man he'd seen at the hardware store was moving at an unnatural pace, and when Lucas had made eye contact, the man had looked away quickly. The store had been open, but the clerk had looked startled when Lucas entered. "We usually close at 5:40, the clerk had said, looking at the clock. It was 5:34. "I just need milk." "I know, but..." The clerk had paused, seeming to decide something. "Just grab what you need, quickly." There it was, the implicit fear, the unspoken dread. Not named, not explained, but present. Whatever people were locking their doors against, whatever they were securing themselves from, it was something that made the clerk nervous about being open at 5:35 p.m. Lucas had paid quickly and left. He'd walked back to his house slowly, deliberately, to see if anything would happen. Nothing had. The streets were empty, the houses closed, lights on but curtains drawn. It was only 6 blocks, but it had felt like crossing through something, a boundary between safety and something else. By the time he'd reached his house, it was 5:42 p.m., and the town was sealed up, locked, secured. He'd gone inside and locked his own door, which he hadn't been doing before. He'd realized he didn't even have a clock in his living room, so he'd bought one. He'd positioned it where he could see it from the kitchen. And the next evening, when it reached 5:35 p.m., he'd locked his door with everyone else. It had felt like joining something, acknowledging something, accepting that he was part of a community that had rules that couldn't be articulated, but that everyone understood. Over the following weeks, he'd stopped asking questions. He'd stopped walking after dark. He'd adjusted his evening routine to accommodate the locking time. He'd noticed that people seemed less wary of him now that he was participating in the practice. Carol at the diner had become friendlier. Harold had smiled when he'd seen Lucas locking his door one evening. Neighbors had started nodding with a kind of recognition. One evening in mid-November, he'd been sitting in his house watching television when his landlord had knocked on the door. This was unusual. Harold had never visited before. Lucas had opened the door at 4:30 p.m. in full daylight, in normal circumstances. "I wanted to talk to you about something," Harold had said. They'd sat in Lucas's living room, and Harold had been careful about how he'd phrased things. "You understand how Millbrook operates," Harold had said. It wasn't a question. "About the doors. I know people lock them at a certain time." "That's right. And you're doing it now." "Yes." Harold had nodded. "The reason I'm mentioning this is because we've had people come to Millbrook before who didn't want to follow that practice, who thought it was strange or paranoid or just didn't understand. And those people don't stay long. They leave. The town rejects them, in a way." "What do you mean the town rejects them?" Harold had been quiet for a moment. "I mean that they start to feel uncomfortable. They start having strange experiences. They realize they can't fit here, and they move on. But if you're willing to accept how we do things, you'll be fine. You'll be safe. You'll be part of the community." "Is there a threat?" Lucas had asked. "Is there something specific that's dangerous?" Harold had stood up. "You're asking the wrong questions. The point isn't whether there's a specific threat. The point is that everyone here has learned, over time, what keeps you safe. We know what time to lock our doors. We do it, and we don't ask why. That's how you survive in a place like this." Survive from what? But Harold had left without answering. Lucas had spent the next few days thinking about what Harold had said. A threat that couldn't be named. A practice that couldn't be explained. A community that enforced participation through subtle pressure and the implicit threat of rejection. It was cult-like in its structure, he'd thought. Irrational. Based on fear rather than evidence. But he'd continued locking his doors at 5:35 p.m. anyway, because despite the irrationality of it, despite the lack of evidence, despite the fact that he couldn't articulate what he was securing himself against, there was a quality to the evening air in Millbrook that justified it. A sense of something waiting at the edge of darkness, something that the locked doors held back. Something that had learned, over years or decades or longer, to test the boundaries at precisely the time when the light failed completely. He'd read about it in a way that made sense to him finally. The town wasn't doing this because of a specific threat. The town was doing this because of an understanding that was older than any of the current residents. Someone, generations ago, had learned not to be outside after dark in Millbrook, had learned that whatever lived in the darkness didn't recognize property lines or safety in numbers, had learned that the only protection was to be inside, to be locked in, at the moment when the boundary between day and night became absolute. And once that practice had been established, once people had accepted it and lived by it, it became the thing that kept the threat at bay. The locked doors weren't a response to the threat. They were the acknowledgement of a boundary that the threat respected. By December, Lucas had stopped thinking of himself as someone who didn't understand the town. He was someone who understood how to live in it. He understood what time to lock his doors. He understood that this wasn't paranoia. It was wisdom. It was the accumulated knowledge of a community that had learned, through whatever experiences had taught them, what the cost of non-compliance was. He'd seen the Bristol family when they'd arrived, newcomers from Iowa, full of skepticism about small-town practices. He'd watched them for the first few weeks, seen them ignore the locking time, walk around after dark, resist the implicit pressure to conform. He'd recognized his own initial skepticism in their behavior. By week 3, he'd noticed they seemed unsettled. By week 4, the mother had mentioned to someone at the grocery store that the children weren't sleeping well. By week 5, the father had had some kind of accident. Nothing serious, but he'd cut his hand badly, and there'd been something in the way he talked about it that suggested it hadn't been entirely accidental. By week 6, they'd listed their house for sale. Lucas had stopped at the diner one morning and asked Carol what had happened. They just decided small-town life wasn't for them, Carol had said. Happens sometimes. People come in thinking they want a quieter place, and then they realize what quiet actually means. He'd understood. The Bristol family hadn't been able to accept that you couldn't fight a boundary that was maintained by the entire community. You couldn't resist a practice that was older than logic and deeper than explanation. You either accepted it and lived comfortably within it, or you rejected it, and the town, in its patient and implacable way, would reject you. Lucas had chosen acceptance. Now, in the deep part of winter, he'd integrated fully into the rhythm of Millbrook. He'd made friends, not close friends, but the kind of cordial acquaintances that small towns offered. He'd had dinner with Harold and Harold's wife. He'd helped someone from church move a table. He'd become a fixture in the community through the simple practice of knowing what time to lock his doors and doing it without question. Every evening, when the light began to fade in that particular way, he'd feel it, the approach of whatever lived in the darkness in Millbrook. He wouldn't see it or hear it, but he'd feel its presence, testing the edges of the town, finding the boundaries, moving along the perimeter of locked doors and secured windows. And every evening, at 5:35 p.m. in the winter months, 5:45 p.m. in the spring and fall, he'd lock his door with everyone else. He'd make sure his windows were secure. He'd stay inside. He'd be part of the understanding that bound the town together. He'd stopped wondering what would happen if he didn't lock the door. He'd stopped asking what was outside in the darkness. He'd learned that some questions weren't meant to be answered. They were meant to be lived within. And the way you lived within them was by accepting the boundaries your community had established, and by participating in the ritual that kept those boundaries intact. Everyone here knew what time to lock their doors, and now so did Lucas. And by knowing, by doing, by accepting without question, he was safe. He was part of something that was larger than himself, older than the town, and far more absolute than any rational explanation could capture. The doors locked at 5:35 p.m. This was the law of Millbrook. This was how you survived here. And Lucas had learned, finally, to stop asking why. Daniel Price was 50 years old when his uncle died and left him a mountain cabin that he'd never known existed. The funeral was in September, a ceremony in Denver attended by distant relatives who seemed surprised to learn that the family had any property at all. The cabin had been his uncle's secret, or not a secret exactly, but something private, something Uncle Raymond had kept separate from the rest of his life. Raymond had been a quiet man, someone who'd worked in insurance for 40 years and had never married and had never seemed particularly happy or unhappy about any of it. He'd driven the same car for 23 years. He'd lived in the same apartment in Boulder. He'd kept his life small and manageable, but he'd owned a cabin in the mountains that no one in the family knew about. The lawyer had explained it to Daniel at the reading of the will. "The property is in your uncle's name," the lawyer had said. "It's a remote location in the northern Colorado range. The deed shows ownership dating back 40 years. There's significant acreage, approximately 80 acres. The property is paid off, so there's no mortgage. Your uncle left it to you specifically, with a note that you might understand its value better than your siblings." Daniel had no idea what that meant. He'd never been close to Raymond. They'd seen each other at family events, had made the polite conversation that distant relatives make, and had never developed any real connection. But Raymond had seen something in Daniel that apparently warranted leaving him a mountain cabin. The drive to the property took 6 hours from Denver. Daniel took the lawyer's directions and drove north on I-25, then west toward the mountains, then took a series of increasingly narrow highways that seemed to climb higher with each turn. The landscape changed gradually. Flat plains gave way to foothills. Foothills gave way to genuine mountains, and by the time he reached the turnoff that the lawyer had circled on a map, he was driving on a dirt road that was barely maintained. The cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, a structure built from logs that had weathered to a silver-gray color, with a metal roof that was streaked with rust. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines, positioned on a slope that dropped away behind the structure. The isolation was absolute. There were no neighboring structures, no power lines, no sign of civilization. The nearest town was an hour away by car, and that was assuming the roads were clear. The lawyer had given him the keys, an old skeleton key and a more modern deadbolt key, and had driven away almost immediately, seemingly eager to leave the remote property. Daniel had stood alone in the clearing, looking at the cabin, trying to understand why his uncle had maintained this place, why he'd never mentioned it, why he'd left it to someone he barely knew. The interior was sparse. There was a main room with a fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom with plumbing that looked decades old. There were a few pieces of furniture, a bed, a table, some chairs, but nothing that suggested Raymond had spent much time here. The air smelled like wood and age, but there was firewood. Stacked neatly outside the cabin, arranged in a careful pyramid, was approximately 4 cords of wood. Fresh wood, cut recently, already split and seasoned. The stack was positioned under a rough roof structure that protected it from snow and rain. The wood was ready to burn. Daniel had found this curious. The cabin was empty. No one had been living here. The dust inside was thick. The windows were covered with a fine layer of neglect. And yet someone had prepared the cabin for winter by stacking fresh firewood. He'd spent that first visit in September cleaning out the interior, opening windows to air out the space, trying to understand what the cabin was supposed to be. He'd found a ledger in one of the kitchen drawers, a record of sorts. The handwriting was his uncle's, neat precise, the writing of someone methodical. The entries were date-marked, going back 30 years. Firewood delivered. Roof repaired. Supplies brought in. There were references to a local contractor, someone named Marcus Wheeler, who apparently had handled maintenance for decades. Daniel had driven back to the nearest town, a place called Evergreen Valley, and had asked around about Marcus Wheeler. He'd found him at a hardware store, a man in his 60s with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life in the mountains. "I knew Raymond," Marcus had said when Daniel explained who he was. "Good man, quiet, paid his bills on time. I handled the maintenance on the cabin for years." Why was he paying for the cabin to be maintained if he never used it? Daniel had asked. Marcus had looked at him with a particular kind of expression, not quite sympathy, but something like it. "Did he leave it to you?" "Yes." "Then you'll understand soon enough," Marcus had said. "The cabin's worth keeping up. It's not the kind of property you just abandon." But Daniel hadn't understood. He'd gone back to Denver, back to his job as an engineer, back to his normal life. He'd thought about the cabin occasionally, but hadn't returned to it until November, when the season had begun to turn, and he'd suddenly thought about the firewood and whether there was still enough of it for a full winter. He'd driven back to the property in early November, as the first serious snow was beginning to fall at elevation. The cabin had been undisturbed since his September visit. The dust was still thick. Nothing had changed except for the accumulation of fallen needles on the porch. But there was new firewood. A second stack had been added beside the first one, another cord or more of freshly cut, split, and seasoned wood. The work was professional. The stacking was precise. There was no evidence of how it had been delivered or who had done it, but the wood was there. Daniel had checked the road. There were fresh tire tracks, but they were old enough that it was hard to say exactly when they'd been made. More than a week old, probably. Someone had driven up to the cabin, stacked wood, and left. And no one had told Daniel about it. He'd driven back to Evergreen Valley and had found Marcus at the same hardware store. Someone delivered firewood to the cabin, Daniel had said. Marcus had looked unsurprised. Of course they did. Who? How did they know to do that? I didn't arrange it. Your uncle arranged it, Marcus had said. Before he died, he set up a standing order. Every autumn someone delivers firewood. It's been happening for years. Who delivers it? Someone from a local logging operation. I don't know the specifics. Your uncle handled the arrangement directly. Daniel had requested the contact information for the logging operation, but Marcus had said he didn't have it, that Raymond had handled everything independently. Daniel had asked if there was a charge for the firewood delivery, and Marcus had said there probably was, that the money likely came out of Raymond's estate. This explanation had satisfied Daniel for a time. His uncle had arranged for the cabin to be maintained, for firewood to be delivered, for someone to keep the property functional, even though Raymond wasn't using it. It was eccentricity, but it was explainable eccentricity. He'd returned to Denver and had tried to verify the arrangement through the lawyer, but the lawyer had no record of any standing orders for firewood delivery or any payments to logging companies. The estate had been simple. The cabin, some savings, a few possessions. No mention of ongoing services or deliveries. But the firewood had continued to appear. Daniel had visited the cabin again in December after the first major snowfall. The cabin was accessible only by careful driving. On the snow-packed dirt road, conditions were getting worse. By February, the road would likely be impassable, but in December it was still manageable. The firewood stacks had not changed. No additional wood had been added, but none had been taken either. The stacks that had appeared in early November remained intact, perfect, unchanged. He'd visited again in January, driving with chains on his tires, moving slowly through the snow. The road was becoming more difficult, but he'd made it to the cabin, and the firewood was still there, the same stacks, unchanged, waiting. By February, the road was impassable. Heavy snow had accumulated, and the weather service was predicting more. Daniel had monitored the conditions from Denver, checking weather reports, watching the snowfall accumulate. He'd thought about the cabin, thought about the firewood, thought about the mystery of how it kept appearing in the autumn. In March, when the snow had begun to melt and the road had become marginally passable again, Daniel had driven back to the cabin. He'd expected the road to be barely navigable, expected to find the cabin perhaps damaged by snow loading, expected to see evidence of the harsh winter. What he'd found was another cord of firewood, not in addition to the previous stacks, but arranged as a third stack, positioned beside the others, fresh, split, ready to burn. The only explanation was that someone had driven the logging truck up the road during the winter, during the snow, when the conditions were at their worst. Someone had navigated to the cabin through weather that Daniel had thought made the location inaccessible. Someone had stacked firewood despite the extreme conditions. This discovery had unsettled Daniel in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He'd spent the afternoon at the cabin trying to find evidence of the recent delivery. Tire tracks, footprints, anything that would indicate human activity. But the snow melt had erased the tracks. There was nothing to confirm when the wood had been delivered, nothing to suggest how it had been done. He'd sat in the cabin that night, the first time he'd actually stayed overnight, and had built a fire in the fireplace. The wood had caught easily. It had burned hot and clean. And he'd sat by the fire, alone in the cabin, surrounded by windows that looked out at the dark mountains. And he'd thought about his uncle. Why had Raymond kept this place? Why maintain it so carefully? Why arrange for firewood to be delivered every autumn and apparently in winter as well? What had the cabin been to him? Over the following years, Daniel found himself drawn back to the property more frequently. He'd started spending weekends there, then weeks at a time. He'd made minimal improvements, replacing some of the window panes, fixing the roof in a few places, ensuring the interior was weatherproofed. But he hadn't fundamentally changed anything about the cabin. It remained as his uncle had left it, sparse, isolated, beautiful in its austerity. And every autumn, the firewood appeared. Daniel had stopped trying to investigate the delivery. He'd stopped asking Marcus questions, stopped trying to track down the logging company, stopped attempting to solve the mystery. Instead, he'd come to expect it. He'd come to depend on it. When autumn arrived, he'd check the cabin and would find the firewood there, stacked and ready. The delivery always happened in early November, before the snow became heavy. And in some years, not every year, but occasionally, a third stack would appear during the winter months, as if someone was monitoring the cabin's needs and replenishing the supply. He'd brought his daughter, Sarah, to the cabin once. She was 30 now, living in San Francisco, engaged to someone Daniel had met only once. She'd flown to Denver and had driven with him to the mountains. He'd wanted her to understand why he spent so much time here, why the cabin had become central to his life. "It's beautiful," Sarah had said, standing on the porch, looking out at the mountains. "But it's so isolated, Dad. Don't you get lonely?" "Sometimes," Daniel had said. "But the isolation is part of what it offers. A place where you don't have to be anyone. You just are." Sarah had looked at the firewood stacks. "Someone's been maintaining this pretty well." "Yes," Daniel had said. "Who?" "I don't know," he'd said. "Someone. My uncle arranged it before he died. Whoever it is, they keep doing it." Sarah had looked at him with concern. "That's kind of strange, Dad. Have you thought about trying to find out who it is? They might expect something from you." "I know," Daniel had said, but he hadn't pursued it. The mystery had become part of the cabin's character. The firewood appeared as a gift, as providence, as something that the mountain itself was providing. Sarah had left after 2 days. She'd said the cabin made her uncomfortable, not in an unsafe way, but in the way of spaces that seemed to be waiting for something. "It feels like the cabin is expecting you," she'd said, "like it's keeping you for a reason." After she left, Daniel had stood alone in the cabin and had thought about her observation. The cabin did feel like it was expecting something. The firewood appeared without explanation, year after year, maintaining a promise that no one had explicitly made to Daniel. The property sustained itself through an unseen mechanism, a system of provision that predated him and would presumably continue after him. He'd begun to understand that the cabin wasn't a refuge he'd inherited. It was a responsibility. And the firewood wasn't a gift, it was a signal. Someone was maintaining the cabin because the cabin needed to be maintained. Someone was ensuring that there was wood for heat because heat was necessary for survival in the mountains. Someone was keeping a promise that Daniel's uncle had made, and that Daniel, by accepting the cabin, had inherited. By his 55th year, Daniel had taken a leave of absence from his job. He'd arranged for a small income, rental income from a property in Denver, and had essentially moved to the cabin full-time. He'd spent his summers maintaining the property, upgrading what needed upgrading, but trying to preserve its essential character. He'd spent his winters in the cabin using the mysterious firewood, warming himself by fires that existed because someone, somewhere, had decided the cabin was worth preserving. He'd stopped questioning the firewood. He'd stopped wondering who delivered it. He'd come to see the delivery not as a mystery, but as an agreement. His uncle had made an arrangement with someone, perhaps a local logging company, perhaps someone from the town, perhaps the mountains themselves, to maintain the cabin. Daniel had inherited that arrangement, and he'd accepted it. He'd also come to understand that the arrangement came with an obligation. The cabin was maintained not just for him, but for whoever might need it. He'd invited Sarah to stay multiple times, but she'd always declined. He'd mentioned the cabin to colleagues from work, but no one had expressed serious interest. The cabin remained essentially empty, occupied only by Daniel for a few months of the year, empty the rest of the time. And yet, the firewood continued to appear. In the autumn after his 55th birthday, Daniel had made a decision. He'd written a letter to the town of Evergreen Valley, posted it to Marcus Wheeler, explaining that the cabin was open to anyone who needed shelter. He'd changed the lock at the cabin to a keypad combination and had written the combination in the letter, along with instructions for anyone who might arrive needing heat and refuge. No one had ever used the offer. As far as Daniel could tell, the cabin had remained his private space, but he'd made the decision to extend the understanding that had kept him alive, the understanding that someone, somewhere, was responsible for maintaining the cabin, and that he'd inherited that responsibility along with the property. The firewood continued to appear every autumn. As the years passed, Daniel found that he looked forward to its arrival with genuine anticipation. He'd make the drive from Denver in early November, would arrive at the cabin in the weak mountain sunshine, and would see the fresh stacks of wood waiting for him. He'd stopped trying to understand it. He'd stopped trying to solve the mystery. He'd accepted that some things in the mountains operated according to their own logic, their own systems of exchange and obligation. The cabin required heat. The firewood appeared. That was sufficient. On the autumn after his 60th birthday, Daniel made the drive to the cabin as he always did. The road was clear. The weather was mild. The cabin sat in the clearing as it had for decades, waiting. And beside the cabin, in its familiar position, was the stack of firewood. Fresh, split, seasoned, ready. Daniel had parked and had walked over to inspect it. The wood was the same quality as always, stacked with the same professional precision, placed in the same location. It was perfect. He'd gone inside the cabin and had lit a fire. He'd made coffee and had sat by the flames, watching the heat dance against the stone of the fireplace. And he'd thought about his uncle, about the arrangement Raymond had made, about the responsibility he'd inherited. The cabin would keep him warm all winter. The firewood would sustain him through the cold. Someone, somewhere, was keeping the bargain that had been made long before Daniel's arrival. And Daniel, sitting by the fire, understood that he would keep it too. He would maintain the cabin. He would use the firewood. He would ensure that the property remained viable, remained available, remained a refuge in the mountains for anyone who might need it. The mountains provided, but they expected something in return. They expected gratitude, understood as continued occupation, continued maintenance, continued acceptance of the mystery. Daniel had spent 50 years learning to be comfortable with questions that had no answers. He'd lived with his uncle's secret property, with the uncanny delivery of firewood, with the isolation of the mountains. And finally, in the evening light of October, sitting by a fire that was burning, because someone had stacked wood for him, he'd made peace with it. The cabin would provide, the firewood would come, and he would stay, maintaining the agreement, preserving the mystery, keeping the fire alive.